Rain washed the blood and motor oil off the pavement. Maeve spent her nights selling bruised roses to drunks, entirely unaware her father had just gambled away her life. When the men came to collect, they didn't want cash. 3 rival syndicates. 3 ruthless men who ruled the city's underbelly. They couldn't agree on who owned the deadbeat's daughter, so they decided to share. This isn't a fairy tale. It's a hostile takeover. Stick around to hear how the asset became the boss. The cold seeped through the soles of Maeve's boots. It was a vicious, wet chill, the kind that settled into the marrow and stayed there. She stood under the flickering neon sign of a pawn shop, a plastic bucket of chrysanthemums and cheap red roses at her feet. At 2 a.m., the city was a beast that only fed on the desperate. Maeve blew on her cracked hands. She hadn't seen her father in 4 days. This wasn't unusual. Richard had a habit of disappearing into the smoke-filled basements of the Diamond District, chasing the elusive high of a winning hand. He always came back smelling of cheap whiskey and panic. Tonight he didn't come back at all. Instead, a black Lincoln Town car pulled up to the curb. It didn't park. It idled, the heavy rumble of its engine vibrating through the wet asphalt. Maeve stiffened. The street, usually populated by stray cats and stumbling addicts, emptied out in seconds. Instinct told her to run. The heavy canvas bag strapped across her chest held exactly $42 and change. It wouldn't buy her a ticket out of the state, but it might get her across the river. Before she could pivot, 2 more cars boxed the Lincoln in. One was a sleek, armored Mercedes. The other, a battered but heavily modified SUV. Doors opened. The sound of heavy doors shutting echoed like gunshots in the quiet street. 3 men stepped onto the pavement. They didn't look at each other. They looked at her. Roman stood by the Mercedes. He wore a tailored charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than the city block. His face was sharp, impassive eyes, like chipped flint. He looked less like a gangster and more like a corporate executioner. Declan leaned against the SUV. He was broad, his jaw covered in rough stubble, a leather jacket pulled tight across his shoulders. He was the kind of man who broke bones with his bare hands and slept soundly afterward. He chewed on a toothpick, his gaze scraping over her with open hostility. The 3rd man stepping from the Lincoln was Victor. Older by a decade, silver at his temples carrying a heavy silver-tipped cane he didn't seem to need. He projected an aura of absolute, terrifying calm. "Maeve," Victor said. His voice was a low rumble. "Leave the flowers." Maeve didn't move. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. "I don't know you. You know your father," Roman interjected. His tone was surgical, clipping the wet air. "He owes my organization $400,000. He owes Victor's syndicate $500,000. He owes Declan's crew a shipment of unregistered firearms he lost at the docks." Maeve swallowed. The taste of copper flooded her mouth. "I don't have it. I sell flowers." Declan let out a harsh laugh, spitting the toothpick onto the pavement. "We know what you sell, sweetheart. Dickie bolted, left the state, but he left a marker." Declan reached into his jacket. Maeve flinched, preparing for a gun. Instead, he pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, thick with her father's frantic, jagged handwriting. He tossed it. The wind caught it, pasting it against Maeve's shin. She peeled it off with numb fingers. "Take the girl. She works hard. She'll earn it off." The words blurred. Her stomach dropped, twisting into a sick, tight knot. He hadn't just abandoned her. He had traded her, used her as poker chips to buy himself a head start. $1 million. Maeve whispered, the absurdity of the number choking her. "I can't earn $1 million. Not selling weeds, no." Roman said, checking a silver watch. The dispute tonight was over jurisdiction. Richard played all 3 of us. Usually that ends with a body in the river. But since he's gone, the debt falls to the collateral. "We flipped for you." Declan smirked. Nobody won. We don't like sharing. Victor stepped forward, the rubber tip of his cane hitting the concrete with a dull thud. We reached a compromise. You are an asset with a debt. Until that debt is settled, you belong to the joint holding. You will come with us. If you run, Declan's hounds will drag you back. If you fight, Roman will freeze your accounts and ruin anyone who helps you. If you lie to me, well, you won't. Maeve looked at the bucket of roses. The petals were browning at the edges. She looked at the street, dark and indifferent. She was 22. She had a high school diploma and dirt under her fingernails. She didn't scream. Screaming didn't work in this part of town. She unbuckled the canvas money bag and dropped it onto the wet pavement. Fine, Maeve said, her voice shaking only slightly. Who's driving? Roman's eyes narrowed. A flicker of something surprise, maybe respect, crossed his face. Declan laughed again, louder this time. Victor simply opened the rear door of the Lincoln. Get in, Victor said. The ride was suffocating. Maeve sat in the back of the Lincoln, sandwiched between Victor and the heavy bulletproof glass. Roman and Declan followed in their respective vehicles. The convoy moved like a shark through the city streets, cutting through red lights without hesitation. The heat inside the car was stifling. Maeve's damp coat smelled of cheap soil and rainwater. She felt filthy sitting on the pristine, cream-colored leather. You're quiet, Victor noted. He hadn't looked at her. He was staring out the window, watching the city blur past. Would talking change my situation? Maeve asked. She kept her hands folded tightly in her lap to hide the tremors. No. Then I'm saving my breath. Victor turned his head slowly. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue. They were eyes that had seen terrible things and ordered worse. Pragmatism. Rare in someone your age. Your father is a hysterical man. It seems you didn't inherit his temperament. I didn't inherit anything from him, but debt. They arrived at an estate on the northern cliffs far past the city limits. It wasn't a home. It was a fortress. High iron gates, cameras swiveling blindly in the dark, armed men walking the perimeter with dogs. The cars parked in a sprawling gravel courtyard. Maeve was ushered inside. The foyer was vast, echoing, floored in cold marble. It felt like a mausoleum. Roman and Declan walked in behind them. The three men gathered in the center of the room, leaving Maeve standing by the heavy oak doors, dripping water onto the polished stone. They spoke in low, clipped tones. They were discussing her like a piece of stolen art. How to store it. How to insure it. She smells like the gutter. Declan grumbled, shrugging off his leather jacket. He glared at Maeve. What do we even do with her? Put her in a maid's uniform? Have her scrub the floors for the next 50 years? She has no practical skills. Roman agreed, pulling off his leather gloves, finger by finger. But she represents leverage. If Richard resurfaces, we have his daughter. Richard won't resurface, Victor said softly. He's a coward. He considers her dead. She is our problem now. Maeve stepped forward. Her boots squeaked against the marble. I'm not a problem. I'm a person. I can work. Just tell me what the terms are. 3 pairs of eyes snapped to her. The terms, Roman asked, his voice dripping with condescension. You think this is a bank loan? I think you're businessmen, Maeve fired back. Her fear was metastasizing into anger. The raw, jagged sting of her father's betrayal was acting as a bizarre anesthetic. You didn't shoot me in an alley. You brought me here. That means you want something. So what is it? What's the interest rate on my life? Declan crossed the room in 3 long strides. He crowded her space, towering over her. He smelled of tobacco and gun oil. He reached out his rough thumb, grabbing her chin, forcing her head up. His grip was bruising. Maeve didn't blink. She stared straight into his dark, volatile eyes. You got a mouth on you, flower girl, Declan growled. You don't make terms. We own you. We say jump, you ask how high. We say strip, you ask what song. Maeve's heart slammed against her ribs, but she kept her voice dead level. If you wanted a whore, you could have bought 10 for what my father owed you. You want your money back. I'll work. But I don't bleed for you, and I don't spread my legs for you. That's my term. Declan's jaw tightened. For a second, Maeve thought he was going to hit her. Instead, a quiet, dry chuckle echoed through the foyer. Roman. Let her go, Declan, Roman said. Declan sneered, dropping his hand, but he didn't back away. Victor leaned on his cane. You will be given a room in the East Wing. You will not leave the estate. You will be assigned duties. If you perform them adequately, you will be fed and housed. The principal of your debt will be recalculated annually. It was a life sentence dressed up in corporate jargon. Show her to her quarters. Victor ordered one of the guards, standing silently by the stairs. As Maeve turned to follow the guard, she felt the weight of their stares. She wasn't just a ledger entry anymore. She had pushed back, and in their world, prey didn't push back. They didn't know what to do with her yet. Good. She would use that. A week passed. The estate was a cold, beautiful prison. Maeve's room was larger than the apartment she had shared with her father. It had a balcony overlooking the cliffs, a massive bed with silk sheets, and a bathroom entirely out of marble. They gave her clothes, neutral colors, expensive fabrics, cashmere sweaters, tailored trousers. She hated them. They felt like a uniform. Her duties were surprisingly mundane, yet entirely psychological. She wasn't scrubbing floors. Roman put her to work in the library, organizing records and digitizing old ledgers. Not the sensitive ones, just the shell companies, the real estate holdings. He was testing her. Maeve sat at the massive mahogany desk, her eyes scanning lines of data. She was quick with numbers. Growing up poor meant you always knew exactly how much things cost to the penny. The door opened. Roman walked in. He didn't knock. He poured himself a glass of water from a crystal carafe on a side table, watching her. Maeve didn't look up from the laptop. You found the discrepancy in the shell company's tax filings, Roman stated. It wasn't a question. Someone was skimming off the top, Maeve replied, highlighting a row on the spreadsheet. 3% of the gross routed through a dummy corporation in the Caymans. Clumsy. They used the same routing number for the past 4 quarters. Roman walked up behind her. She could feel the heat radiating from him, smell the sharp, clean scent of his cologne. He leaned over, resting one hand on the back of her chair, the other on the desk. He was caging her in. You didn't flag it. I highlighted it, but you didn't report it to me. Maeve finally turned her head. His face was inches from hers. The proximity was deliberate, designed to intimidate. I'm a hostage Roman, not an auditor. You want me to find the leaks in your empire, you start paying me a salary to knock off my debt. Roman's eyes darkened. The impassive mask slipped just a fraction. You forget your place, Maeve. My place is a line item on your balance sheet, she said, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline spiking in her veins. You're testing me to see if I'm smart. I am. If you want to use that, compensate me. Otherwise, fire me. He stared at her for a long, heavy moment. Then slowly a dangerous smile curved his lips. Careful. Arrogance is a quick way to get yourself hurt. He straightened up and walked to the door. Deduct 5,000 from your principal. The door clicked shut. Maeve let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She was playing with fire, but she had to. If she remained passive, she would disappear in this house. She had to make herself valuable. That afternoon she encountered Declan. She was walking through the West Gardens, a sprawling, manicured labyrinth of hedges. The fresh air was the only thing keeping her sane. She heard the heavy thud of fists hitting a heavy bag before she saw him. Declan was in a makeshift outdoor gym beneath a glass pavilion. He was shirtless, his torso covered in dark, sprawling tattoos that looked like prison ink mixed with high-end artistry. He was punishing the heavy bag sweat gleaming on his shoulders. Every strike sounded like a car crash. Maeve tried to walk past, keeping her head down. "Stop!" Declan barked, not breaking his rhythm. Maeve froze. She turned slowly. Declan threw one last vicious hook, then caught the swinging bag. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving. He grabbed a towel and wiped his face, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he asked, walking toward her. "Playing numbers with Roman. Trying to act like you belong here." "I'm trying to survive," Maeve said, crossing her arms over her chest. The autumn wind was biting, but she refused to shiver in front of him. "Survival around here means keeping your head down," Declan said. He stopped a foot away from her. The raw violence rolling off him was palpable. "You don't make demands of Roman. You don't make demands of any of us. Or what?" Maeve challenged, surprising herself. The exhaustion of the past week was boiling over into recklessness. "You'll hit me, put me in the ground. You do that. You lose your money. I'm your collateral, remember?" Declan dropped the towel. His hand shot out, grabbing her upper arm. His grip was steel. He pulled her flush against his chest. Maeve gasped, her hands instinctively coming up to push against him. It was like pushing against a brick wall. "Don't play games with me, flower girl," he whispered, roughly, his face inches from hers. "Roman might care about spreadsheets. I don't. I care about respect. You push me, I push back. And I promise you, I hit harder." Maeve glared up at him. She didn't struggle. She let her hands drop. "Then hit me. Or let go." Declan searched her eyes. He was looking for fear for the trembling submission he was used to. He didn't find it. Maeve's eyes were hard, anchored by a deep, hollow anger that mirrored his own. His grip loosened just slightly. His gaze dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second before snapping back to her eyes. He let her go, stepping back as if he'd been burned. "Stay out of my way," Declan muttered, turning his back on her and walking toward the house. Maeve stood in the garden alone, her arm throbbing where his fingers had dug in. Two down. Dinner that night was the first time she sat with all three of them. The dining room was cavernous. A long mahogany table sat beneath a dripping crystal chandelier. Victor sat at the head. Roman to his right, Declan to his left. A place was set for Maeve at the far end, miles away. The silence was oppressive. The clinking of silver against porcelain was the only sound. Maeve pushed the steak around her plate. She had no appetite. "I hear you've been productive in the library," Victor said, cutting into his meat without looking up. "She's adequate," Roman replied, coldly taking a sip of wine. "She's a headache," Declan muttered, tearing a piece of bread in half. Maeve looked down the length of the table. "I'm right here. You don't have to talk about me like I'm a piece of furniture." Declan scoffed. Roman didn't react. Victor slowly laid his knife and fork down. He picked up his napkin, dabbed his mouth, and finally looked at her. The weight of his gaze silenced the room. Even Declan stopped chewing. "You are alive because we allow it," Victor said. His voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. It carried the absolute authority of a man who held life and death in his hands every day. "You sleep in a warm bed because we provide it. Do not mistake our restraint for weakness, Maeve. You are testing boundaries. I suggest you stop before you find them." Maeve gripped the edge of the table. "I just want to know when it ends. A year. 10 years. When is the debt paid?" "The debt is paid when we say it is paid," Victor replied smoothly. "You belong to this house now. You belong to the three of us. Your father's life is over. Yours has just begun. I suggest you acclimate." He picked up his fork and resumed eating. The conversation was over. Maeve looked at the three of them. Roman calculating her worth. Declan fighting the urge to break her. Victor casually holding her leash. They thought they owned her. They thought they had acquired a helpless, terrified girl they could mold and use until she broke. Maeve took a slow sip of her water. She looked at the heavy silver knife next to her plate. She wasn't going to break. She was going to adapt. If they wanted her to be a part of their world, she would learn the rules. And then she would rewrite them. November stripped the trees bare around the estate, leaving the sprawling grounds looking like a graveyard of dead wood and frozen earth. Inside, the temperature was strictly regulated, but Maeve felt the cold anyway. It lived in the walls. It lived in the men who walked the halls. 3 months had passed. The sharp, frantic terror of her first week had dulled into a heavy, persistent ache. Survival was no longer about escaping into the night. It was about navigating the minefield of the 3 men who owned her paper. She spent her days in the library. Roman had given her access to the secondary ledgers, the legitimate businesses they used to wash the blood off their cash. Laundromat's real estate trusts a chain of high-end car dealerships. Maeve sat at the mahogany desk, her eyes burning from the harsh blue light of the monitor. The clock on the mantel ticked past midnight. She was cross-referencing shipping manifests from a port authority in Boston with the stated inventory of their import company. The numbers didn't lie. Men did. The heavy double doors swung open. Roman stepped inside, loosening a silk tie. He looked exhausted, the sharp angles of his face cast in shadow. He didn't acknowledge her immediately. He walked to the liquor cabinet, poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a heavy crystal glass, and downed it in one smooth motion. "You're skimming again," Maeve said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the tremor it held months ago. Roman paused, setting the glass down with a soft clink. He turned his dark eyes, fixing on her. "Excuse me, not you specifically, but someone in your Boston sector." She turned the laptop around, pushing it to the edge of the desk. The shipping manifests list automotive parts, high-tariff heavyweight, but the fuel consumption logs for the transport trucks don't match the weight. They're running light. Whatever is in those crates, it's not engine blocks. Roman walked over. He leaned down, his hands resting on the edge of the desk bracketing her. The scent of scotch and cold city air washed over her. He stared at the screen, his jaw ticking. "They're moving narcotics on our dime," Roman said quietly. It wasn't a question. It was a death sentence for whoever was running the Boston docks. "And they're using your logistics network to bypass the cartel taxes," Maeve added. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "You're losing about 80 grand a week in potential transit fees, plus the liability. If the feds pop those trucks, your shell company goes down." Roman didn't move. He kept his eyes on the screen, his breathing slow and measured. "You found this by looking at fuel receipts. I found it because people are lazy. They lie on the manifest, but they tell the truth at the gas pump." He finally looked at her. The proximity was suffocating. There was a dangerous intensity in his gaze, a quiet hum of predatory calculation. "You are incredibly useful, Maeve. It's starting to become a problem." "Why, because you might have to start paying me." Roman let out a short, breathy laugh that lacked any real humor. "Because things that are useful become targets, and I don't like sharing my assets." He straightened up, buttoning his jacket. "Print the logs. I'll make a phone call." He left without another word. Maeve exhaled slowly, her hands shaking just slightly. She was making herself indispensable. It was her only armor. Later that night, the armor cracked. Maeve was in the massive industrial kitchen pouring a glass of water. The house was dead quiet. Then the back door slammed open. Declan stumbled in. He was a mess. His leather jacket was torn, his knuckles were split open and bleeding sluggishly, and a dark, swelling bruise covered the left side of his jaw. He reeked of copper sweat and cheap beer. He stopped when he saw her leaning heavily against the stainless steel island. He breathed through his teeth, a low hiss of pain. "Don't look at me like that," Declan warned, his voice a gravelly rasp. Maeve set her glass down. "Like what? Like I'm a stray dog that just got hit by a car. Stray dogs usually have the sense to run away from traffic." She shot back. She walked to the large first aid kit mounted on the wall near the pantry. She pulled it down and set it on the island. "Sit." Declan scoffed, but his legs gave out a second later. He dropped onto a bar stool, gripping the edge of the counter. Maeve opened the kit. She grabbed a bottle of antiseptic and a stack of gauze. She stepped into his space. Up close, the damage was worse. A jagged cut ran along his hairline, bleeding down the side of his face. She poured the clear liquid onto the gauze. "This is going to sting." "I don't feel it," he grunted. She pressed the gauze to his forehead. Declan flinched violently, his massive hand shooting up to grip her wrist. His fingers dug into her skin, a bruised, desperate pressure. Maeve didn't pull away. She met his gaze. His eyes were wild, dilated, buzzing with leftover adrenaline. "Let go, Declan," she said softly. He stared at her, his chest heaving. Slowly his fingers relaxed, sliding down her arm before dropping to his lap. "You shouldn't be patching me up. You should be putting a knife in my neck." "I considered it," Maeve admitted, wiping the blood from his cheek. "But Roman would probably add the cost of the carpet cleaning to my debt." A rough, startling laugh ripped out of Declan's throat. He winced immediately, holding his ribs. "You're twisted flower girl. You know that. Look who I live with." She taped a butterfly bandage over the cut. Declan watched her hands. His gaze dropped to her mouth, lingering there in the quiet, heavy air of the kitchen. The hostility that usually radiated from him was gone, replaced by something much heavier. Something hungry. "Why do you stay?" Declan asked suddenly. "You're smart enough to slip the security cameras. You could run. Victor said you'd track me down." "I would," Declan agreed quietly. "But why haven't you tried?" Maeve threw the bloody gauze into the trash. "Because out there, I'm a target for my father's enemies. In here, I'm an investment. You don't break your own toys. I figure my odds are better playing house with the devil." Declan reached out his rough, bruised fingers, catching a strand of her hair that had fallen out of its clip. He tucked it behind her ear. The touch was jarringly gentle. "We aren't the devil, Maeve. We're worse." The summons came on a Tuesday. Victor rarely left the estate, orchestrating his empire from the velvet armchair in his study. But today was different. He stood in the foyer wearing a heavy black overcoat, leaning on his silver-tipped cane. Roman and Declan were flanked behind him, both heavily armed. "Get your coat, Maeve," Victor ordered. "You are coming with us." Maeve froze halfway down the staircase. "Why?" "Because you found the leak in Boston," Roman answered, his tone clinical. "The man running the docks, Callahan, has agreed to a sit-down. He claims the numbers are a clerical error. We need you there to tell him to his face exactly how he stole from us. You want me to be an accountant at a mafia execution?" Maeve's voice rose, panic finally piercing her carefully cultivated calm. "It is a negotiation," Victor corrected smoothly. "And you are the proof. Do not make me ask twice." An hour later, Maeve stood in the back room of a defunct meatpacking plant on the edge of the city. The smell of old blood and bleach was thick enough to taste. Victor sat at a rusted metal table. Roman stood by his right shoulder. Declan was pacing by the heavy steel doors. Maeve was positioned slightly behind Roman, clutching a leather binder full of printed spreadsheets like a shield. The doors opened. Callahan walked in. He was a large, sweating man, flanked by 4 heavily tattooed enforcers. He looked nervous. He had reason to be. Victor Callahan greeted, pulling out a chair. It screeched against the concrete floor. "This is a misunderstanding. The fuel logs are a symptom," Victor interrupted, his voice dropping the temperature in the room. He didn't look at Callahan. He looked at the wall. "Maeve, read the summary." Maeve stepped forward. Her legs felt like lead. She opened the binder. From April to October, fuel consumption en Route 4 ran 20% under the required payload weight. Correlating with the Port Authority timestamps, 72 crates bypassed customs. The discrepancy amounts to roughly $3 million in diverted assets. Callahan's face flushed, an ugly mottled purple. He glared at Maeve. "Who the hell is this bitch? You bring a secretary to disrespect me. Victor?" "I brought the girl who caught you," Victor said, finally turning his pale eyes on the man. "You owe us 3 million Callahan, plus a penalty for the insult." Callahan stared at them. The silence stretched tight and brittle. Then Callahan smiled. It was a sick, desperate smile. "I don't owe you shit," Callahan spat. He dropped his hand beneath the table. Everything happened in a chaotic, deafening blur. Roman grabbed Maeve's collar, violently yanking her backward, just as the table splintered. Gunfire erupted, a deafening percussive roar inside the concrete walls. Maeve hit the floor hard, the wind knocked out of her lungs. Dust and concrete shards rained down. Roman stood over her, his pistol barking twice. 2 of Callahan's men dropped. Declan was a blur of motion. He didn't use a gun. He slammed into Callahan's largest enforcer, driving a combat knife up under the man's ribs. "Get her out." Victor barked over the noise, incredibly still, sitting in his chair, though he had drawn a compact revolver. Roman hauled Maeve up by her arm. "Move." They sprinted toward the back exit. A bullet shattered the overhead fluorescent light, plunging the room into a strobing, chaotic darkness. Maeve couldn't hear anything over the ringing in her ears. More men poured through the front doors. Callahan had brought an army. It was an ambush. Roman right flank. Declan roared, dropping his bloody knife and drawing a heavy handgun. Roman shoved Maeve behind a rusted steel pillar. "Stay down, do not move." He stepped out, laying down, covering fire. Maeve pressed her hands over her ears, curling into a ball. The smell of cordite was choking. She watched paralyzed as the 3 men who owned her fought a war in front of her. They moved with terrifying synergy. Roman was precise lethal. Declan was raw, devastating force. Victor, despite his age, anchored the room, taking calculated shots that never missed. But there were too many. A bullet clipped Roman's shoulder, spinning him backward. He cursed, dropping to one knee, but kept firing. Declan saw it. He roared, breaking cover to draw the fire away from Roman. He vaulted over a fallen metal beam, shooting a man in the chest. But another enforcer stepped out from the shadows of the meat lockers. The man raised a shotgun, aiming dead at Declan's back. Maeve didn't think. The spreadsheets, the debt, the hostage situation, it all vanished. If they died, Callahan would take her. She scrambled forward, grabbing a heavy iron meat hook that had fallen from the ceiling track. She swung it with everything she had. The heavy iron connected with the back of the enforcer's knee with a sickening crunch. The man screamed, his leg buckling. The shotgun blasted into the ceiling, raining sparks down on them. Declan spun around his gun, raising instinctively, but stopped when he saw Maeve standing over the writhing man, her chest heaving, the iron hook still clutched in her bleeding hands. He didn't hesitate. He put a bullet in the man's head, silencing the scream. The gunfire abruptly stopped. The room was heavy with smoke and the metallic stench of fresh blood. Callahan was dead, slumped over the rusted table. 7 of his men littered the floor. Declan stared at Maeve. Roman slowly stood up, gripping his bleeding shoulder, his eyes wide as he looked at her. "Are you hit?" Victor's voice cut through the ringing silence. He was untouched, dusting concrete off his overcoat. "No," Maeve whispered. Her hands were shaking so violently she dropped the hook. It clanged against the floor. Declan stepped over a body and grabbed her by the shoulders. His hands were covered in blood, staining her sweater. He looked her up and down, frantically checking for bullet holes. "You stupid girl." Declan breathed his voice, thick with an emotion she hadn't heard before. You broke cover. He was going to shoot you, she managed to say, her teeth chattering from the adrenaline crash. Roman walked over. He looked at the man she had crippled, then at her. The clinical detached mask was entirely gone. You saved his life. Maeve looked at the three of them, covered in dust and blood, surrounded by corpses. If he dies, Maeve said, her voice shaking. Who's going to beat up the people who owe you money? Declan let out a breathless, broken laugh. He pulled her against his chest, wrapping his massive arms around her. He didn't care about the blood. He just held her. Roman watched them, his jaw tight, his hand pressing against his bleeding shoulder. Victor stood in the background, leaning on his cane, a profound, chilling realization settling over his features. The ledger was closed. The dynamic had permanently shifted. The ride back to the estate was silent, but the silence had a different texture. It was no longer the oppressive quiet of captors and a captive. It was the heavy, buzzing silence of survivors in a foxhole. The estate's private doctor met them in the garage. Roman's shoulder was a through and through a clean exit wound. Declan had bruised ribs and a superficial graze on his thigh. Victor was entirely unscathed. Maeve was taken to a pristine white medical bay in the basement. A nurse cleaned the shallow cuts on her hands. She had torn her palms open, swinging the rusted iron hook. Once she was bandaged, she was left alone in the sterile room. She sat on the edge of the examination table, staring at the white floor tiles. Her mind was looping the violence, the sound of the shotgun, the way Roman bled, the way Declan held her. The door clicked open. Roman walked in. His left arm was in a black sling. He had changed out of his bloody suit into a dark cashmere sweater and loose trousers. He looked pale, but his eyes were sharp. He didn't speak immediately. He walked over to the stainless steel counter, picked up a bottle of water, opened it, and handed it to her. Maeve took it with bandaged hands. "Thank you. I owe you a debt," Roman said quietly. He leaned against the counter, facing her. "You risked your life for my brother in arms. You stepped out of cover. You could have been killed." I panicked. "No, you didn't. Panic is freezing. Panic is running. You picked up a weapon?" Roman's gaze swept over her face, tracing her features as if seeing her for the first time. "I calculated your value based on your intellect. I failed to factor in your grit." "Are you recalculating my principle, Roman?" she asked, a tired, cynical edge returning to her voice. "The debt is irrelevant." Victor's voice echoed from the doorway. Maeve looked up. Victor stood there, casting a long shadow into the bright room. Declan was right behind him, a fresh bandage visible beneath his dark t-shirt. He looked massive in the doorway, his eyes fixed intensely on Maeve. Victor walked into the room, the rubber tip of his cane squeaking faintly against the linoleum. "Your father's marker was a piece of paper. It bought your presence. It did not buy your loyalty. What happened today? That cannot be bought." "What does that mean?" Maeve asked, her heart picking up a frantic rhythm. "It means," Declan said, stepping around Victor, his voice a low rumble, "you aren't collateral anymore. You aren't a hostage." "Then let me go," Maeve challenged, looking between the three of them. No one moved. The air in the room grew instantly heavy, thick with a suffocating tension. Roman pushed off the counter. He walked slowly toward her, stopping only when his knees nearly brushed hers. "We can't do that." "Why not?" "Because you know too much," Victor stated practically. "Because I won't let you." Declan growled, his jaw clenching. He stepped up beside Roman. Maeve looked at the men surrounding her. They were a triad of violence, power, and wealth. For months, they had kept her at arm's length, a tool to be used and eventually discarded. But the blood shed today had acted as a binding agent. They had seen her bare her teeth. They had seen her step into the fire with them. "You don't own me," Maeve whispered, though the words lacked their usual conviction. Roman reached out with his uninjured hand. He touched her cheek, his thumb lightly brushing across a smudge of dirt she hadn't managed to wash off. The touch was electric, sending a shiver down her spine. "No," Roman agreed softly, his eyes locking onto hers. "We don't own you. We claim you. There is a difference. A claim requires my consent." She shot back, fighting the sudden, terrifying flutter in her stomach. "You swung a meat hook at a man holding a shotgun to save my life," Declan pointed out, leaning in. He smelled like sterile alcohol and clean soap, a sharp contrast to the blood from hours ago. "You've already consented, Maeve. You just haven't admitted it to yourself yet." Victor watched the exchange with calculating pale eyes. He didn't intervene. He was managing his assets, and he realized the asset had become the fulcrum of his organization. "You will move out of the East Wing," Victor instructed smoothly. "You will take the master suite on our floor. You will no longer answer to the guards. They will answer to you. You are under our protection, fully and unconditionally." Maeve swallowed hard. "A gilded cage is still a cage, Victor." "It is a fortress," Roman corrected his hand, dropping from her face. "And you are no longer a prisoner inside it. You are the architect. They were changing the rules of the game. They weren't setting her free. They were pulling her deeper into the labyrinth, offering her power instead of liberty. The terrifying part was she didn't hate the idea. The anger and betrayal she harbored toward her father had burned away, leaving a cold, hard ambition in its wake. If they wanted to make her a queen in their underworld, she would accept the crown. But she would make damn sure it fit perfectly. "I want the Boston accounts," Maeve said, breaking the silence. Roman blinked. Declan let out a low whistle. "Callahan is dead," Maeve continued, lifting her chin. "His infrastructure is a mess. The feds will be crawling all over those manifests by morning. I know the numbers. I know the routes. I can fix it before it bleeds back to the estate." Victor tilted his head, a genuine smile, rare and terrifying, ghosting across his lips. "You want to run our logistics? I want 1/3 of the gross profit from that sector deposited into a private account in my name," Maeve countered, looking directly at Victor. "I fix your mess, I get equity. I am not an employee. I am a partner." Declan started laughing. It was a booming, genuine sound that echoed off the sterile walls. "God, she's ruthless." Roman's eyes darkened with raw, undisguised desire. He looked at her not as a problem to be solved, but as an equal. 1/3 is steep. 1/4, 30%. Maeve negotiated her heart, hammering against her ribs. "Done," Victor agreed before Roman could argue. He tapped his cane once on the floor. "Welcome to the family, Maeve." They left her there to rest, but the room felt different after they walked out. It wasn't a cell anymore. It was a war room. Maeve looked at her bandaged hands. She had been abandoned by her father, sold for $1 million and dragged into hell. But hell, it turned out, was manageable if you learned how to negotiate with the demons. She wasn't a flower girl anymore. She was a boss, and she was going to bleed them dry. The master suite smelled of cedar and expensive espresso. Maeve stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the frozen cliffs. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer that mirrored Roman's, her hair pulled back into a severe knot. It had been 3 weeks since the bloodbath at the meatpacking plant. True to his word, Victor had moved her out of the East Wing. She was now the geographic center of the estate's power dynamic. Roman's suite was to her left. Declan's was to her right. Victor occupied the entire floor above them. She was insulated by them, guarded by them, and increasingly funded by them. She turned back to the massive glass desk dominating the room. 4 monitors glowed in the dim morning light. The Boston logistics network was a rotting carcass, and she was the vulture picking it clean. Callahan had left behind a mess of unpaid bribes, phantom shell companies, and a crew of terrified dock workers who didn't know who to take orders from. Maeve didn't send them orders. She sent them payroll. She doubled their hourly rate and cut out the middle management. Loyalty bought with blood was fickle. Loyalty bought with direct deposits was absolute. The door opened. Declan walked in. He didn't bother knocking anymore. He was dressed in dark jeans and a heavy wool sweater, carrying a plate of toast and a mug of black coffee. He set it on the glass desk, right over a printed schematic of the Port Authority. "Eat," Declan commanded. "I'm reviewing the customs schedules for Pier 4, Maeve said, not looking up from her screen. Declan reached out his massive hand, covering her mouse, stopping her movements. He leaned over her shoulder. The heat radiating off him was a stark contrast to the cold glass of the desk. "You've been staring at that screen since 4 a.m., Declan noted. His voice was low, a rough vibration against her ear. "The crates aren't going anywhere. Miller is sitting on them." Miller was Callahan's former lieutenant. He had survived the purge by being out of town, and now he was trying to leverage the stalled shipments to negotiate his own seat at the table. He was holding $40 million worth of untaxed electronics hostage on the docks. "Miller is an idiot," Maeve said, leaning back into Declan's solid chest. She didn't realize she was doing it until his arm casually dropped around her waist, anchoring her. "He thinks he has a choke point. He doesn't realize I control the routing numbers for the trucking union. He can hold the crates on the dock all year. Without my trucks, they rot in the salt air." Roman walked in a moment later. He was on his phone, speaking rapid, fluent Italian. He hung up, tossing the device onto one of the leather sofas. His left arm was out of the sling, though he still moved it with calculated stiffness. "The union rep agreed to the freeze," Roman announced, walking toward the desk. He looked at Declan's arm around Maeve, his eyes darkening a fraction, but he didn't object. "No trucks move in or out of Pier 4 until Miller capitulates." "He won't capitulate," Maeve said. She picked up the coffee Declan brought her and took a sip. It was bitter, exactly how she needed it. "He's old guard. He thinks because I'm a woman, and because I started as collateral, I'll blink if he threatens violence." Roman leaned against the edge of the desk, crossing his arms. "He threatened to burn the storage units." "Let him," Maeve replied coldly. "The electronics are insured through our own dummy corporation. If he burns them, we claim the loss wash the insurance payout through the Caymans, and Miller takes the heat for arson. He does our laundry for us." Roman stared at her. A slow, deeply appreciative smile spread across his face. It was the look of a man who had just found a diamond in a coal mine. "You built a failsafe." "I built a trap," she corrected. "But we still have to go to Boston." Declan stiffened behind her. "No, you aren't leaving the estate. Miller needs a face to surrender to." Maeve argued, spinning her chair around to face them both. "If Victor goes, it elevates Miller. If you two go, it's a physical threat, and his men might panic and shoot. If I go, it's an insult. It tells him he isn't worth the bosses. He's only worth the accountant. An accountant he might put a bullet in." Declan snarled. "Not if you're standing behind me," Maeve said quietly. The silence in the room stretched. Declan looked at Roman. A silent conversation passed between them, a negotiation of risk and reward. "She's right." Victor's voice drifted from the doorway. He stood leaning on his cane, perfectly groomed in a three-piece suit. "Miller operates on ego. Maeve operates on data. Ego shatters. Data doesn't." Victor walked fully into the room, his pale eyes fixing on Maeve. "You will go to Boston. You will speak for the syndicate. But if he raises his voice to you, Roman will empty his accounts. If he raises a hand to you, Declan will empty his skull. Are we clear?" Maeve stood up. The fear that used to paralyze her was gone. In its place was a cold, sharp adrenaline. "Pack a bag," Maeve told the room. "We have a flight to catch." The Boston warehouse was freezing. The wind off the harbor whipped through the corrugated metal walls, carrying the stench of dead fish and diesel exhaust. Maeve sat at the head of a rusted folding table. Roman stood to her right, wearing a cashmere overcoat, his hands resting lightly in his pockets. Declan stood to her left, arms crossed, staring holes into the men standing across from them. Miller sat at the opposite end of the table. He was a wiry, nervous man with a bad complexion and an oversized leather jacket. He had brought 6 men with him. They looked cold and miserable. "I don't negotiate with secretaries," Miller sneered, though his eyes darted nervously to Declan's massive frame. "Good," Maeve said. She didn't raise her voice. She opened a sleek leather folio. "Because this isn't a negotiation. It's an eviction." Miller barked a harsh laugh. "You think you can just walk onto my docks?" "They aren't your docks," Maeve interrupted smoothly. She slid a piece of paper across the table. "You lease them from the city. Or rather, a shell company named Apex Holdings leases them. As of 9 a.m. this morning, Apex Holdings was acquired by a parent corporation, my corporation. I am your landlord, Miller." Miller stopped laughing. He looked at the paper. "You owe 3 months back rent," Maeve continued, her voice devoid of empathy. "You are in breach of contract. The Port Authority has already been notified to freeze your operational licenses. Furthermore, the trucking union has blacklisted your foreman. You can't move a single crate off this pier." "I'll burn it all to the ground," Miller threatened, slamming his fist on the table. His men shifted uncomfortably, hands drifting toward their waistbands. Declan took half a step forward. The sound of his heavy boots on the concrete sounded like a hammer dropping. Miller's men froze. "If you burn the crates, we collect the insurance," Roman stated smoothly, pulling his hands from his pockets to reveal a suppressed pistol resting casually against his thigh. "And the fire marshal will trace the accelerant right back to you. You'll spend the rest of your life in federal prison." Maeve folded her hands on the table. "You have no leverage, Miller. You have no money. You have no trucks. As of this exact second, you don't even have a job." Miller stared at her, his face pale sweat beading on his forehead, despite the freezing temperature. He looked at his men. They were looking at the exits. They knew a sinking ship when they saw one. "What do you want?" Miller rasped, the fight completely draining out of him. "I want the keys to the freight offices," Maeve said. "I want your men to load our trucks, and then I want you to leave Boston. If you ever show your face near our logistics network again, I won't send an eviction notice. I'll send Declan." Miller swallowed hard. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a heavy ring of keys, and tossed them onto the table. They clattered harshly against the rusted metal. He stood up, knocking his chair backward, and walked out without another word. His men followed instantly. The heavy warehouse doors slammed shut, leaving the 3 of them alone in the cavernous space. Maeve let out a long, slow breath. Her hands were trembling just a little. Roman picked up the keys. He looked at her, a profound reverence in his sharp eyes. "Checkmate." "She gutted him," Declan muttered, shaking his head. He looked almost entirely bewildered. "Didn't fire a single shot, just buried him in paperwork." Maeve stood up, closing the leather folio. The adrenaline crash hit her all at once, making her knees weak. She swayed slightly. Declan was there instantly. He caught her by the waist, pulling her flush against him. The smell of gun oil and heavy wool enveloped her. He didn't let go. "I'm fine," Maeve whispered, though she leaned heavily into his chest. Roman stepped closer. He reached out his cool fingers, gently tilting her chin up. The industrial lights cast harsh shadows across his face, but his eyes were burning. "You are spectacular," Roman murmured. He didn't ask for permission. He leaned down and pressed his mouth to hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was possessive, a branding. It tasted of cold air and raw adrenaline. Maeve gasped, her hands instinctively grabbing the lapels of his overcoat. She kissed him back, pouring months of terror survival and hard-won triumph into the connection. When Roman pulled away, he kept his forehead resting against hers. Declan's grip on her waist tightened. He pulled her slightly back, forcing Roman to step back, but he didn't let Roman leave the circle. Declan's hand tangled in the hair at the nape of Maeve's neck. He tilted her head back and took her mouth, his kiss rougher, desperate tasting of smoke and unspoken devotion. Maeve closed her eyes, entirely overwhelmed, entirely anchored. She had been sold to monsters, but they weren't monsters to her anymore. They were her shield, her sword, and her sanctuary. They shared everything, their empire, their violence, and now her. She didn't feel like a piece of property divided among thieves. She felt like the sun they all orbited. "Let's go home," Roman said, quietly, his voice slightly hoarse. They walked out to the waiting SUV. Maeve sat in the middle of the back seat, Declan's heavy arm draped over her shoulders, Roman's hand resting firmly on her knee. She was no longer the flower girl shivering in the rain. She was the queen of the syndicate. Spring finally thawed the estate. The gardens were blooming a vibrant splash of color against the heavy stone walls. Maeve was in the conservatory drinking tea with Victor. He was reviewing the quarterly projections she had finalized that morning. Boston was running flawlessly. Profits were up 40%. Her private account had hit 8 figures 2 weeks ago. "You've streamlined the Montreal routing," Victor noted, turning a page. "Efficient. Roman couldn't have negotiated the tariff reduction you secured." "Roman uses threats," Maeve said, taking a sip of her tea. "I use tax loopholes. They both work, but mine leaves less of a mess." Victor chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. Indeed, one of the perimeter guards stepped into the conservatory. He looked tense. "Boss, we have a situation at the main gate." Victor didn't look up from the ledger. "Handle it." It's Richard Sir, Maeve's father. He tripped the perimeter sensors. He's demanding to speak with Victor. Says he wants to buy his daughter back." The temperature in the room plummeted. Victor slowly closed the ledger. He looked at Maeve. Maeve's hand froze halfway to her mouth. For a split second, the ghost of the terrified girl in the alley flickered in her chest. The man who had sold her. The man who had used her life as a poker chip. Then the feeling vanished, replaced by a cold, hollow apathy. "Bring him to the courtyard," Maeve told the guard. Her voice was steady, entirely devoid of emotion. The guard looked at Victor for confirmation. Victor gave a single curt nod. 10 minutes later, Maeve stood on the front steps of the estate. The afternoon sun was warm, but the breeze carried a chill. Victor stood to her right, leaning on his cane. Roman and Declan had rushed from the west wing the moment they heard. They stood slightly behind her, flanking her like twin gargoyles, their faces carved from stone. 2 guards dragged Richard into the gravel courtyard. He looked terrible. He was gaunt, his clothes hung off him in dirty folds, and his hands shook violently. He had clearly spent the last 8 months chasing whatever high had blinded him in the first place. He looked up, squinting against the sunlight. When he saw Maeve, his eyes widened. She wasn't wearing cheap clothes. She wore a tailored white silk blouse and high-waisted trousers, a diamond necklace resting at her throat, a gift from Roman. She looked radiant. She looked powerful. "Maeve," Richard choked out, scrambling to his knees in the gravel. "Maeve, my God, you're alive!" He looked past her at the 3 men standing in her shadow. "Victor, I have the money. Well, I have a backer. I can get the money. I came to settle the debt. I came to get my daughter." Victor didn't speak. He simply looked at Maeve. It was her show. Maeve walked down the stone steps. Her heels clicked sharply against the pavement. She stopped 10 feet away from the man who had given her life, and then tried to destroy it. "You didn't come to get me, Richard," Maeve said. Her voice was flat, carrying perfectly in the quiet courtyard. "You ran out of credit. You realized the only people who might lend you money are the ones who already own my paper. You thought you could leverage me again." Richard's face crumbled into a mask of pathetic desperation. "No, Maeve, sweetie, please. I made a mistake. I was sick. I'm better now. We can leave. We can start over." He reached a hand out toward her. Instantly, Declan moved. He didn't draw a weapon, but he stepped down, placing his massive frame between Maeve and her father. The sheer violence radiating from Declan made Richard flinch and pull his hand back. "Declan," Maeve said softly. Declan looked back at her. He didn't want to yield. He wanted to break the man's neck. But he saw the calm authority in her eyes. Slowly, reluctantly, Declan stepped back, giving her the floor. Maeve looked down at her father. She felt nothing. No anger. No sorrow. He was just a stranger, kneeling in the dirt. "The debt is paid," Maeve told him. Richard's eyes lit up with frantic hope. "You paid it. You earned it off." "No," Maeve corrected softly. "I bought the bank." She turned her back on him, walking up the steps to stand beside Roman and Victor. She looked out over the gates of the estate, then back down at the trembling man in the gravel. "You have 30 seconds to get off my property," Maeve declared, her voice ringing with finality. "If you ever come back, if you ever say my name again, I won't let Declan handle you. I'll handle you myself." Richard stared at her, horrified. He looked at the 3 terrifying men standing behind her, realizing the truth. She wasn't their captive. She was their equal. He scrambled to his feet and ran toward the open gates, not looking back. Maeve watched him disappear. The last tether to her old life was severed. Roman reached out his hand, sliding smoothly around her waist. Declan stepped up to her other side, his hand resting heavily, reassuringly on her shoulder. Victor smiled a rare, genuine expression of pride and tapped his cane on the stone. They walked back into the estate together. The heavy oak doors closed, sealing the fortress. The flower girl was dead. The Queen was home. Did you love how Maeve turned the tables and took over the syndicate? If this dark, gritty romance kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and subscribe for more audio stories. We drop new intense mafia romances and revenge plots every single week. Drop a comment below telling us which of the 3 bosses, Roman, Declan, or Victor, was your favorite. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow dark romance readers. Stay tuned because the underworld never sleeps, and our next story is even more ruthless.